Assalamu alaikum, hello and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History program. I'm Dr. Mohammed Iqbal and I'll be your host for today's program. I'd like to welcome our panel guests for this program. Amjad Hussain Saab from Leeds and a prominent member of the Muslim Institute. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and thanks for having me.
A pleasure. And Arif Ahmad, again, a person who has a deep interest in history. Arif, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Dr. Bal. Assalamu alaikum.
In the previous programs, we'd discussed the early Islamic history with the setting up the Islamic Caliphate with the Ummayad dynasty. And then we did two programs on the Abbasid Caliphate and their achievements. And in this program, we are going to cover the second period of the Umayyad Caliphate, which was largely around Spain, Al-Andalusia. And just to set the scene for this particular program, before I ask Amjad and Arif to comment, let me just remind you that during the Caliphate of the Al-Walid, the first Umayyad dynasty Caliph, the Berber commander Tariq ibn Ziyad led a small force that landed at Gibraltar on April 30th, 711 CE. This was to intervene in the Visigothic civil war that was going on, and after the decisive victory over King Roderick at the Battle of Guadalete on July 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad, joined by Arab governor Musa ibn Nasir, is it Amjad?
Yes, Musa ibn Nasir.
Brought most of the Visigothic kingdom under Muslim occupation in Andalusia or Muslim Spain, which incorporated Portugal, etc., and going across the Pyrenees as well into the Visigothic Septimania in southern France. So I'm just coming back to really the second period of the Caliphate. In the previous programs, we described how the Abbasid revolution had taken place. Once they consolidated their hold on power, they called all the Umayyad princes and families together for a pardoning dinner. What a pardon it turned out to be. Just take us through that sad event.
Yes, apparently the founder of the Abbasi Caliph Al-Safa and his uncle Al-Mansur, apparently it is alleged that he invited the remaining Umayyad princes to a dinner one night, and apparently on the pretext that there be a truce and forgiveness, but apparently it turned out to be a bloodbath, as it is alleged by some chronicles, but others say that they were poisoned. But one individual, however, managed to escape, and that was Abdurrahman the first.
So basically, the whole of the Umayyad princeling, the dynasty, was destroyed during that banquet. And how old were, I think he was around 20, wasn't he?
20, yes, around 20. Initially, he said he escaped from back to Damascus and there to North Africa, and subsequently he found his way into Cordoba. And remember, at that time, by 11 AD, Muslims already had a foothold on the Iberian Peninsula, and they had consolidated most of the territories around Toledo, Seville, most of southern Spain, and actually up to what we call on the borders of the France, present-day France, Gaul, that all came under
But it
Muslim
wasn't all that easy for him, was it? Because initially, when he landed in Al-Andalusia or Muslim Spain, he was received by a few enthusiastic supporters with a small cavalry. But he had to challenge the governor, the Amir at that stage, who was, what was his name? I think I've got, I think Fihi, the Amir who was actually running.
Yusuf al-Firi outside Cordoba. The Yusuf was eventually defeated, and then Abdurrahman claimed himself to be the Amir of Cordoba, and of course still under tutelage of the Abbasi Caliphate. So he was shrewd enough to realize that the Abbasis were the predominant power in the Muslim world, and there was no point opposing them at this stage at all. So he said to them you be comfortable in Baghdad, and let me get on with the business in the Iberian Peninsula, known as Al-Andalus by the Muslims.
I was just going to add one point. Bear in mind that he was obviously a very young man, but also very shrewd at that point in time. So throughout this time of trying to gain power and trying to ascend to the throne, he wasn't afraid to take advantage of any dissensions or feuds. He actually tried to use those to his benefit. So he was quite a shrewd operator, because he knew that he didn't have a large power base, he didn't have a large army, and this is why, one of the reasons why it took quite a long time. I think overall it took probably around 25 years for him to fully establish this emirate and this caliphate. Sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention also his shrewdness at managing what was available to him in the Muslim Spain at that stage, and also his relationship with the Abbasid. And there's an incident reported that the great Caliph Al-Mansur, who was probably, as we've seen in the previous, one of the greatest rulers of the Abbasid Empire, once asked his courtiers, so who the falcon of the Quraysh was. And I don't know if you've come across this saying, but obviously, as you'd expect, most of the courtiers said, "Oh, great emperor, it's you, of course. A falcon was regarded as a great thing in obviously Muslim culture, etc." And he said, "No, it was not me." And then they went on to say perhaps Amir Mawiya, and then a number of other prominent Muslim rulers. And no, he said the real falcon of the Quraysh was Abdul Rahman, who we failed to capture despite all our spies and all our soldiers and everything, and who left with nothing from here, and yet he has gone to achieve great things in Andalusia. So it just goes to show how much respect he had gained by what he achieved over this time. I don't want to go into all his different sons and grandsons and all the rulers or whatever, but clearly it was his lineage, his progeny, that came to establish the greatness of Muslim Spain. Do any of them sort of strike any great accord with you in terms of the names and achievements?
Of course, Abdul Rahman, before you arrived in the scene on Al-Andalus, let me set the scene. I mean, you already have, but it must be remembered that there were two Muslim factions at that time, universally. One was pro-Abbasi, the other was still Ummayad, had deep influence. After all, they were the caliphs at that time, and Abdul Rahman comes from the ruling elite and the prince in his own right. But above all, he had enormous talents, political shrewdness, and also military prowess, and a genius to survive as well against all odds. So he was adaptable, malleable, and he could make new friends. And I think and he was open to new opinions, and he was prepared to work with new ground realities, as it were. He knew the Umayyad dynasty had been decimated in Damascus. However, there were these new Muslim dynasty, the Abbasis, whom they had dealings with, of course, and they knew each other because, after all, they came from the same Arab pool, as it were. And despite their differences, he realized that it's important to work with new ground realities. And I think that was his political prowess, and he was shrewd enough, and he had great diplomatic skills. And I think that's what really, above all, yes, of course, he fought many battles and feuds, which he won on the Andalusian plains. But above all, it was his diplomatic skills and that consolidated his rule in Cordoba.
I mean, that was also shown by the fact that when he took over Arif as well, the title he adopted, as with the previous Amir under the original Caliphate, was Amir. He could have chosen at that stage to take the Caliphate, but he didn't for the shrewdness, and he took then he passed it on to his son Hisham the First.
I think it was part of his biding his time, I suppose, sort of thinking, well, don't try and become too big, or to develop too quickly, and don't try and become too big a rival. Keep the rest of them happy, and only have this notional title of Amir. And I think that was probably a deliberate ploy on his part to sort of help to consolidate his own influence and his family's influence, and then later on develop this into what it became then known as a caliphate. But in the beginning, yes, it was very much known as an Amir, which is obviously a lesser title than a caliph.
And as I said, it was, although after he passed away, although the exact dates of him passing away are uncertain. It's around 785 to 788 or so. He passed the Imarat or the Amir title to his favorite son, really, Isham. But it was not till much later on when a grandson, Abdul Rahman III, or a progeny and a grandson of is it Abdullah ibn Muhammad, who was around 900, who was the Amir then. And it was Abdul Rahman who felt he had enough consolidation, power, and reason to declare the Caliphate. And also at that stage, Amjad, the empire for Andalusia had extended quite a lot, hadn't it?
Absolutely. The Muslim rule was actually accepted voluntarily by Spaniards, and a number of them converted to Islam. And so, for instance, going back into 1732, from that period, if you look at it, it was only 100 years after the passing of the Prophet. Muslim troops had crossed the Pyrenees and to make their deepest advances into Western Europe, and they were checked at Poitiers in the famous battle, though the Muslim chronicles don't call it quite a battle. It was a minor skirmish, but it's become a legend, of course. But just this highlights the fact that they were inspired by the prophets and the commandments to take the voice of Islam to the furthest corners of the world, and they were diligent. Of course, they came across rivals and they fought on the battle. They were courageous, but above all, they were tolerant, and they knew the dealing with people of the book, and they were careful not to infringe the rights of others, of the conquered and the subdued people. And the society they developed was uniquely tolerant and heterogeneous. Say, for instance, the Arabs and living with Berbers. They were basically North African. Berbers were North African, non-Arabs. So there were Arabs and non-Arabs living side by side with Spaniard Muslims, with Jews and Christians. And of course, intermarriage was fairly common. Andalusia was ruled by the Ummayyads, caliphs in Damascus since, initially, up to 1750. And then the Abbasids came to power in Baghdad, as you mentioned, Iqbal Sahib, and it was really the glory of Islam and the glory of Muslim Andalusia starts with the formative years, and then during the time of the Umayyad Emirate of Umayyad, the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba, and the Umayyad Caliphate, when they became independent from Baghdad and set up their own. That was probably the height of political, cultural renaissance that Andalusia became a model for the rest of the world.
Yeah, this is something I want to pick up with Arif as well, because we talk a lot about tolerance, openness, giving people the freedom to have their faith and their views, etc. And this was one of the beauties of Muslim Spain under these rulers who were so enlightened. Even this day we talk about Muslims in Europe, sure, and the level of tolerance we need to have.
It'll probably surprise a lot of our listeners, whether they're Muslim or not, that first of all, the point worth making is that this was not just Spain. This was what we would call modern day Portugal, Spain, Gibraltar, even parts of southern France and Andorra. And we've talked about this in previous programs, but in nearly all cases, Muslim rule was just and fair. And people, if they didn't want to be Muslims, they were still allowed to leave their lives. Now, you might compare that today and you might think, well, how does this make sense? Because when you see where there are some Muslim countries now, they're sometimes very harsh and not tolerant to their minority groups. But this is a basic Islamic teaching that there's no compulsion in the religion. If somebody wants to accept the religion, of course they can do. But if they don't and they want to have their ability to practice their own religion, of course that's also allowed in Islam. And so this Muslim empire, or this Muslim caliphate, was no real different in that sense as well. Also, there is a pragmatic element as well to this. You want to keep your people happy. You want to keep them, you want to treat them with justice. You want them to look up to you. But the basic Islamic principles are that people should be treated justly and fairly, and this was a key feature of this. And this is one of the reasons why this what helped this caliphate prosper.
I mean, even to this day, two of the sort of great signs left over from this great caliphate, this great empire, are the Mosque of Cordova and Alhambra. And I want to touch on these and to start with yourself, Arif. The Mosque of Cordova and the city itself. I mean, they were just amazing places.
Absolutely.
So just take us through,
Yeah.
because I'm not too sure how many listeners will appreciate the significance of what the Muslims achieved in that city.
Well, Cordoba, I mean, although these days it's a much smaller town, I think it's about 300,000. At the time, at the height of the Umayyad Caliphate, it was probably the most populous city, if not in Europe, then probably in the whole world. And of course, it was a great center for education. It had schools, it had libraries, it had universities. And although it was predominantly a Muslim society, as we mentioned, it did have lots of minorities, and they were all living in peace and harmony with their Muslim neighbors. It was, of course, the capital of the Caliphate, the Umayyad Caliphate. But as I said, there was no. It was a very advanced city, and this was recognized by people whether they were Muslims or non-Muslims. I mean, some of the superlatives, some of the names that it's being called. Some people called it the ornament of the world. It was a great center of politics and finance and economics as well. So it was a great, almost like a magnet, because it brought lots and lots of people in. So the population grew, the influence grew, and of course every great empire or every great republic or country needs a big city as a capital, and Cordoba was this fantastic city that, as I said, even to today, it's I believe it's still a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That's how important it was.
In terms of its size and stature and what it had, Amjad, I mean, prior to Cordova, I think Constantinople was regarded as, the biggest city, although Baghdad itself had obviously a major contribution on the world stage as well in the size and structure. But I think population was over 500,000 at its peak. But it's what was contained in it with the libraries and things. Just take us through just the structure of the city, the libraries, the way civic society was organized.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to mention for your listeners is that Islam has always been. They tolerated other cultures, and Arab society itself was tribal based. So the Prophet said that only among you is not the caste who has value before the Lord is not your caste, not your tribe, but those who are noble indeed and in character. So that basically laid the foundation for cosmopolitanism. So you can come from any culture, any background, and you can coexist as long as you believed in the basic principles and the etiquettes and the Prophet's life known as the Sunnah or the Seerah, the life and example of the Prophet. And of course you were free to go to your churches, your synagogues, your mosques, and that of course gave rise to what I call pluralistic, heterogeneous culture that was thriving, lively, that led it became a beacon for traders, merchants, artisans, philosophers. So commerce, arts, culture, reading and writing naturally flourished. And at that time, it is said that...
I mean, even the development of music had a prominent place. I know nowadays a lot of people sort of give importance to music and Western culture in relation to music, but that lighting, cobbled streets, whilst I think the rest of Europe was in darkness.
Absolutely. It was said that at that time the monastery of St. Gale had 50 volumes of works and books that they boasted about, but yet compared to the library of Cordoba, which had 500,000 volumes on a range of subjects: mathematics, philosophy, geometry, medicine, and some of the prominent works and thinkers of Andalusia are now a common lexicon in the modern world. And I think in the second program of this second session, we will talk about in depth their contribution towards various arts, crafts, and sciences.
I mean, another great sign that they left behind to appreciate even to this age is the Palace of Granada, Arif, and I've had the good fortune of being, I think, 2 or 3 times there. It's one of my favourite buildings and locations, but take us through that as well.
Well, it's obviously still today still a big, very tourist attraction, but there's a long and involved history behind this. I mean, its beginnings were fairly humble. I believe it was a small fortress in the 9th centuries. And it was sort of almost sort of fallen into ruin. I think it was actually originally from the remains of the Roman fortification, but it was rebuilt and renovated and restored to its former glory in the mid-13th century. I think it was Mohammed bin Amir, the Emirate of Granada at the time, who undertook this. In 1333, the meaning of the palace that was built there, the Alhambra, is literally the red, and I think that's because of its red clay surroundings. I think that will probably still to this day one of its prominent features. Again, one of the ways that people describe it, they describe it as a pearl set amongst emeralds. This is how beautiful it is. This is uniqueness, and it's not just its look. It's got great architecture. I think the court of the lions, the fountain, these are all great architectural features which are still admired today. And one of the things which I was reading about, one of the things which has been found out recently is the different styles of wallpaper. Not that I'm an expert on this, but there are 17 possible different styles of wallpaper, and these are all found in this palace. So it shows the intensity, the great thought that went behind. And as I said, it's still a very big and very large tourist attraction even till today.
I mean, under the Umayyad Caliphate, Cordoba and generally Al-Andalus was a beacon of learning, and people came from all over the world, but especially Europe, to all these different libraries and centres. And we're going to touch on some of the great names, really, that Muslim Spain produced, and probably the most prominent amongst those is Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as he was sort of known across the West. And it was sort of in the 1100s, I think, his birth. I've forgotten the exact figure, but tell us. I mean, he was even to this day, his philosophy still reigns supreme to people.
Oh, absolutely. He's also known as Little Aristotle, or the son of Aristotle. He has many nicknames, and he goes by many titles. And of course, he's a Muslim polymath. Ibn Rushd, as you introduced him, he was a man of multiple talents. He was a judge, chief qadi at the court of the Amir, but yet he was a prominent philosopher. So basically, not just brought Aristotle to Europe, and he basically rewrote the works of Aristotle, and he did extensive commentary on Aristotle, some of the difficult theological, philosophical, and issues of life that many philosophers, particularly Aristotle, struggled with, and I'm sure all philosophers have since. And he basically lit the candle of Renaissance in Europe. And like I said, he was a polymath. He was contemporary of the great Muslim mystic known as Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, and his pupil Ibn Tufail, who died in 1188, was also born in Cordoba, and like himself, he also became a chief qadi or a judge at Seville. And of course, he made his most, like I said, most important contribution is, he has got many works, but his most important contributions are his commentary on Aristotle and his refutation of Al-Ghazali's critique of philosophy, and his examination of relationship between religion and reason. Much of Ibn Rushd's thought is refigured in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Take us through this little bit of tiffle that happened between Al-Ghazali and Ibn Rushd, because it formed a very important phase and separation of Muslim thought, didn't it? I want to come to Arif with some of the other things, but it's such an important part of our history, and Ibn Rushd was one of the prominent ones who was a very rational philosopher, wasn't he?
Absolutely, and I think whereas you see here two fountainheads, one with reason and logic, the other with metaphysics. So we have the great metaphysician in the Muslim world and the great logician in the Muslim world battling it out, and this was really cordial. It's not battling it out is not quite the thing, because here were intellectual debate and vigor, and they both held each other in high esteem because of their own backgrounds, and they had respect for each other's learning, and of course Ibn al-Arabi said that once, I think, to in one of the sittings with Ibn Rushd, was that look, what all that you have learned is just a drop in the ocean of in Allah's scheme of things, and that Allah just doesn't work by His signs, which He does. Of course, the signs are there for man to discover, but much more lies beyond that you do not see. Your rationality cannot comprehend the powers, and I should say, I think in one of them he says, just on the one, think on the name of Al-Rahman, the Merciful. He said, you can no logic and comprehend the attribute of the Lord. So there the two set the scene, and I think which goes on to this day among the Muslim theologians and philosophers and logicians is the physical world, the manifestation, and the metaphysical.
I mean, I think this is an area that we can do a whole separate program about, the battle, intellectual battle between the Mu'tazilites and anti-Mu'tazilites, and the whole idea of, I love some of the titles of the books they came, the incoherence.
The incoherence. Yeah, that's one of the works of Ibn Rushd, because that's his critique of Ghazali's, against philosophy.
Oh, it's fascinating. But at this stage, we should take a break, and we'll come back for the second part very soon. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the second part of our program. We were talking about the contribution of Ibn Rushd, or Averroes as is known in the West. And one of the most interesting things I found, Arif Sab, was how rational his whole approach was towards theology, politics, social developments, and how brave he was, to be honest, at challenging everything. We pride ourselves in a very secular society, don't we, in the West here, and how open we are. And your own take on...
Well, absolutely. I mean, bear in mind that he was living at the time of the 12th century. I think he lived from 1126 to 1198. Now, a lot of Muslims, although they may have been pious, they may have had this philosophy that whatever happened was because of God's will. So if God wanted something to happen, it would happen. He started to not in effect challenge it, but think more rationally, as you said. So, he was a great philosopher. He also was a great proponent of logic and jurisprudence, maths and science. And his argument is that phenomenon followed natural laws that God had created. So although things did happen, they were around the laws that God had created. And he had a great impact not just on Muslims in Spain, but also on a lot of the Christians in Europe. And in fact, some people have called him the founding father of secular thought in Western Europe. That's how high, in such high esteem he's held. Because, as I said, he was challenging, in a way, in a nice way, these views that the large majority of Muslims had. But he was also able to back it up. So he was a great writer. He would put down what he thought in writing. He would explain why he thought that. And this obviously... the intention was really to stimulate debate and also try and understand the world around him. And there were many scientists and many writers that built upon the work that he started. But he was obviously brave enough to sort of start that at a time when not many others were thinking about this.
You mentioned, Amjad, earlier on how Thomas Aquinas and many others had really taken on his ideas, Ibn Rushd's ideas. And I think originally it was Michael Scott who went to Toledo in Muslim Spain and got the various writings and Ibn Rushdi's and Ibn Sina and many others, and took them to Italy, and then the whole Renaissance started. But the whole concept about the cosmological arguments about was there a beginning or not, or is the universe infinite? And I'm quite fascinated of how Ibn Rushd also contributed to that, because clearly his idea was also taken on from Aristotelian view that the universe has been infinite as well. And yet, on the other side of Muslim civilization, we had people like Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali who were the proponents of the Kalam cosmological argument of a beginning as well, which later on with the Big Bang and all the experimental. But do you want some comments on that?
Well, we can put these, in modern perspective, but, setting it back in medieval Islam, at the time of the 8th, 9th, and the 10th and the 12th centuries, it's important to realize that they used semantics and dialectics that were rooted deeply in their own culture and cultural thought. Of course, they took on a lot from the Romans, from the Greeks, but of course, when the Prophet came, the Prophet of Islam, and the essential thing was it was based on the book. So Muslims and Islam is a very bookish religion, because the whole thing starts with the kitab, and then the second emphasis is on reading, writing, and learning, and the outcome is that if they are truly Allah's irrefutable laws, then they you're not committing any shirk. Actually, they should be examined to understand Allah's creation, and that was the central point of the theme of Islamic logicians and the Mutazilites. They were not counter to any theology or Allah's unity. If anything, they were out to prove Allah's unity. That how man can get nearer to Allah is by looking at the workings of Allah's laws, Allah's creation, and that was the central theme. Of course, they did get bogged down in some cosmological and theological debates eventually, because they were more of a philosophical and arbitrary debates, and which linger on in Muslim intellectual discourse. But that was not really the main emphasis. The emphasis was to experiment, and unfortunately, at the end of the 12th century, Ghazali's Islam and his thought became prominent, and Muslims have since really lost on the whole thing of logic and reasoning and experimental sciences. But one, Ibn Rushd not just actually influenced Thomas Aquinas and the Renaissance, but he also influenced his contemporaries, and he had many students in the Muslim. One in particular to mention is Ibn Tufail, who was a pupil of Ibn Rushd, and he was born in Cordoba and became a chief qadi and a judge of Seville. And actually, it was his working of the works of Ibn Rushd that have become prominent, and he explained Ibn Rushd in a peculiar sense, and I think so. And also, of course, the people that Ibn Rushd influenced and actually is contemporary to is somebody called Ibn Hazm. He extended traditional romantic poetry. He talked about the logic and reasoning as well, and it's the works of many of these prominent thinkers and practitioners of Al-Andalus, along with the writings of Eastern Muslims, were translated from Arabic into Latin in Muslim Spain. And through these translations, the philosophical and scientific thoughts of not just the Greeks and the Romans, but also India and China found its way into Renaissance Europe, that actually fueled the Renaissance. For instance, Alderad of Bath, he traveled extensively in Al-Andalus. So did Michael the Scot you mentioned. And then eventually, when on 1492 the Muslim sovereign rule in Spain came to an end, it did not mean the end of Muslim culture. Actually, if anything, most of these people found their way into Sicily. The Book of Rogers is very famous. It talks about cartography, about modern cartography, map making, and so on. Idris's famous world map, which is based on the sphere, Many people at that time believed in a flat earth. So it's not just that. And of course, the work of Ibn Tufayl and Ibn Rushd. My colleague, esteemed colleague Arif here mentioned these prominent physicians. But of course, not to forget, on the side of astronomy, I think you mentioned Gaber ibn al-Aflah, who lived around the 11th century. He was astronomer and excelled in mathematics. He invented
interesting thing, a lot of his work also influenced Ibn Rushd as well, who came after him as well. And much of his work influenced Copernicus over time as well.
Oh, of course, Copernicus, Newton, and Galileo to a degree as well. And of course, he is Gaber ibn Aflah. He is the person who converted, made a mechanical device that transforms as the sphere coordinates into flat geometry on a flat, and that just not just transform cartography, but also give rise to what we call modern day calculus, where you convert spherical, which is curved space, into flat space, and vice versa by doing, what is the modern technique. So this is a great breakthrough since Euclid. So we're going from flat space of trigonometry, geometry, into what we modern day we call calculus. Calculus is probably attributed these days to Newton and so on, but of course, the spring for this and the foundations were laid in Muslim Spain.
You mentioned earlier when we were talking Ibn Majah as well, Arif Sab. Do you want to share some thoughts with us about his achievements?
Yes, Ibn Majah. I mean, the fascinating thing about this is that you see experts in lots and lots of different fields. Now, Ibn Majah was a linguist, and his main area, although he was proficient in many different areas, his area that he's remembered for is grammar. Now, most Muslims will know that Arabic is a very, very rich language, and it has lots and lots of deeper meanings. And to understand those meanings, you have to know the rules of grammar. You have to understand the rules of grammar. But his understanding of grammar was probably way, ahead of his time. He was challenging the views. It caused it ruffled some feathers. People didn't like his way of thinking. But again, it's part of that thing about these scholars were always thinking, always wanted to develop things. His way of trying to rationalize and understand things was to understand the grammar of the Arabic language, to interpret things better, so that he could explain things, understand the Holy Quran and other Arabic literature, and he made great contributions in this area.
And talking about scientists, one of the interesting things that I think we all grew up with as youngsters was seeing the landing on the moon. With all those creators and whatever, and believe it or not, we have a great Muslim whose name is taken by a creator on the moon, and the Latinized version name is Arzakel, is Al-Zarqali is the Muslim name. But tell us a little bit, Amjad, about him, because clearly they wouldn't have given the moon crater a name if he wasn't a prominent figure, and certainly from Andalusia, he was one of the great Muslim scientists as an astronomer.
Yes, at the back of course, Al-Majist, which is the works of Ptolemy, which is well known, is of a Greco-Roman origin. The Muslims, scientists, and astronomers, not just adapted, they actually converted an Earth-centric view of the universe into heliocentered, i.e. the sun-centered. That the sun was the center of our solar system. It was long, before Newton, Copernicus, and Galileo was known to the Muslim world. And Al-Majis, which is the book of stars, coming back from Greco-Roman culture, most of the stars, not just the crater on the moon, but we look at Aldabran, the Grey Bear, Betelgeuse, one of the stars, to name a few, and of course Azimuth, which is basically the highest point in the sky. Is many terms in astronomy, modern day astronomy, are named after Muslim and Arabic names. And of course, the great Muslim astronomer, he reworked Al-Majist. He actually corrected many of the mistakes in Al-Majist, and it was basically Al-Majist in the Greco-Roman world was earth-centered, so it became heliocentered. And then, of course, you quite rightly said they placed the Venus in its proper perspective, not between the earth and the moon, but of course its proper place in the solar system.
It's worth bearing in mind that all of these astronomical terms, naming planets and naming craters, it's not lay people that get to choose. It's usually very esteemed scientists. It's a bit of a close shop. So it counts a lot if a crater, it might seem like a simple thing, or a planet or a star is named after you, because it's the scientists of that time who discover it, that they're the ones that choose. It's not the general public that choose. So it shows you how in such high esteem that they held these people.
Interesting. A lot of the work that was translated from Arabic into Latin and brought into Europe was by Gerard of Cremona. And in the 12th century, he translated al-Zarqali's work into Latin. And he referred to al-Zarqali as an astronomer and a magician. It's amazing how highly rated a lot of his work was, and the respect that he showed for him. There's another great thinker in a different field as well, and I want us to touch on that as well, and that is Al-Zarawi. Is that the right pronunciation, Amjad? He was a great surgeon, and some would say the father of surgery. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yes. He wrote extensively on surgery, not just on surgery, on pharmacology, medical ethics, and doctor-patient relationship. And a century and a half later, is one of his pupils or one of his followers, Ibn Zahar, was a great advocate of clinical research and practical experimentation. So Al-Zawahiri also is the founder of some of these the modern the scalpel and many other instruments that are used in modern day surgery are attributed back to him, and to of course the famous father of medicine known as Avicenna, who wrote the Canon of Medicine, and of course there's general practice in medicine, whereas Al-Zawahiri was in medicine as well as surgery, and because these things, when you had an ailment and people thought that it was due to either you're possessed by a demon, or that was imbalance, or you had or the bloodletting. So people will that day was a common theme, and even it continued into 18th century Europe, where leeches were applied to people, so because they thought that there was swelling or so on, and it was caused by blood, so blood had to be let. No, but Muslims, scientists knew, because they were experimental scientists, and they realized that it was of course due to imbalance, was mainly these things can be corrected through medicine and particular plant medicine, also mineral-based medicine, which is so they've basically founded, along with surgery and medicine, pharmacology and pharmacy, which is basically today as it is practiced today. And of course it came with the great science of chemistry being the foundation of all these. So it was basically either bacteria that caused it, or viruses, or basically unhealthy lifestyle. And those were very early recognized, and they thought that these could be corrected by surgery. Not by amputation, but people could be.
I think it was a much more refined methodology as well. Some of the European, they were very, very brutal. It was like cut it out or cut off the limb, or as you said, crude methods like leeches. But there was a lot of refinement and also great thought and purpose behind these treatments. It wasn't just something that was done very randomly.
Oh, absolutely.
It's interesting. Al-Zarawi's greatest contribution in medicine was his book Kitab al-Tasrif, which is a 30-volume encyclopedia, and I think it was highly used for over 500 years across the whole of Europe, and his contribution to the hereditary nature of haemophilia. And he was probably the first physician to describe an ectopic pregnancy, which even to this day is one of the most troubling things, for modern medicine as well. So a great thinker. But, it wasn't just the practical scientists and surgeons and astronomers that Andalusia produced. There were some great philosophers and poets and mystical thinkers, and none greater than the great Sheikh Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. Do you want to tell us a little bit about him? Because for me, he's one of my favorite mystical, spiritual guides from the early days of Islamic civilization.
Yes, absolutely. I think he lived in the late 12th century, 1165 to 1240. So many attributes, just a few of them. A great scholar, a Sufi mystic, a poet, a philosopher, a great expert in Islamic law. And also a lot of his information and knowledge was gained by travel. So he was a great traveller. He lived in Spain, but he also travelled to Mecca. He travelled throughout Syria, Palestine, Iraq, Jerusalem, Egypt. And I think he wrote, I read somewhere that he wrote maybe as many as 800 books. And he was trying to trying to get people to reach a higher goal in their life. And his focus was to place less reliance on worldly matters and less focus on worldly matters and material gain and the clothes that you wore, and obviously to constantly contemplate and think about your higher purpose. And he spent basically all of his life trying to do this. Again, controversial in some respects, as obviously people don't agree when people are challenging, and some people even thought that he was maybe an apostate or a heretic. So there was this imbalance, but of course his contribution was immense, and his literature is still around and still widely read today.
Any other great thinkers that you want to comment on before we sort of talk more broadly?
Well, Ibn Battuta is all regarded as North African, but actually he's Andalusian as well. He's one of the greatest tourist and traveler of his time. He went to North Africa, Syria, Mecca, Medina, and all over the world. He went to Yemen, he sailed down the Nile, and went to Asia Minor and the Black Sea. He went to Crimea and to Constantinople, Afghanistan, India, and beyond. It's possible to do justice to all the scholars of Al-Andalus who devoted themselves to study of history and linguistic sciences. But there are prime social sciences cultivated by the Muslims and were brought to a high level of art in Andalusia and elsewhere. And another person to mention is Ibn al-Khatib or Ibn al-Khattab, whose theory of contagious diseases we have already touched upon when we mentioned the physicians. But he was also the author of the finest history of Granada that comes down to us to this day. Ibn al-Khatib was born in 1330 near Granada and followed the traditional educational curriculum of his time. He studied grammar, poetry, natural sciences, and Islamic law, as well as the study of the Quran. His father, and it was an important official who was killed by the Christians. The ruler of Granada invited him to occupy the post of a secretary in the department of correspondent, and he became the confidant of the ruler and gained great position of great power and influence. And despite his political career, Ibn al-Khattab found the time to write over 50 books on his travels, on medicine, poetry, music, history, politics, and theology. He was only rivaled by those of his contemporaries like Ibn Khaldun, the first historian. The intellectual and cultural influence of Al-Andalus, although Al-Andalus is no more, and the last Muslims were expelled in the 17th century, although the Muslim sovereign rule came to an end in the 15th century. But Al-Andalus lives as a kind of not just a mirage, but a real example of coexistence, of pluralism, where Muslims, Christians, Jews, and non-believers can coexist.
It's interesting you talk about the end of Muslim rule and the sad, I suppose, interaction between Christendom and the Muslim world, especially in Islam. When I was young, I remember watching a movie, big Hollywood movie. Remember, Arif, called El Cid? And in that, the Muslims were portrayed as barbarians, and the Saracens were sort of all divided into different groups or whatever, and Charlton Heston was the hero saving Christian Spanish plane, and it was all an absolute nonsense. Do you remember seeing it, or were you too young?
Maybe a bit too young, but I get the general gist. I mean, of course, it's very it's a great simplification to say these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. It's a lot more complicated than that. Various reasons, political reasons, corruption that can happen with any empire. I've said before in programs that all empires eventually come crashing down. But of course, if you're not just and you don't treat your people properly, or people get jealous, or people sometimes feel that they are better or have more power, that can cause imbalances in a society. And this obviously took place over many, many centuries. And of course, at the appropriate time, the Muslims, their opponents, decided that this was enough and they needed to remove them. But that's almost a natural phenomenon as well. It can't just be put down to one thing. It's a variety of factors that come about that.
No, absolutely.
And it wasn't just Charlton Heston, I'm sure, that defeated the Muslim Empire.
No. It's interesting when you go to the Alhambra and you just see this magnificent place that was created by some great people of the time. And one of the things, I can't remember exactly what the Arabic inscription is, but I do remember it says, God or Allah alone is victorious. That was by, I can't remember who actually built. There was Abdul Rahman III, or
yes, I think one of the rulers of
whichever
Granada,
rulers,
yes.
they built it, and they put the inscription on to remind him and every other ruler that Allah, God alone is victorious. Empires come and go, and kings come and go, and whatever. So I think we've had a fascinating. I mean, when most people look back upon the Muslim civilization, certainly, for Andalusia, the Islamic civilization, the Umayyad dynasty was part of their golden age. And I think it's certainly within the Islamic civilization, we've had two particular golden periods during the Abbasid period and during the Umayyad period in Spain as well. But overall, 1450 years of history, Amjad, we've done some great things as a Muslim civilization, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's important to remember that Islam is not just deals with spirituality and metaphysics, but also with man's daily life. And also, of course, the central theme of Islam is Abrahamic, which is the unity of the Lord. But Muslim, this is what has always, occupied Muslim the great thinkers, is like Ibn al-Arabi on the metaphysical side, to Ibn Rushd, to Ibn al-Haytham, the great physicist, is that Lord is unique and Lord is one. And of course, also Muslims in the 19th and the 20th century, like Dr. Abdul Salam, with his unification of the weak force and electromagnetism and the weak force. But of course, it's we'll sum up the Muslim Spain is that of course at the end of 15th century, the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella were at the gates of Granada itself, and there remained only like one act to be played, and that was for the Muslim ruler at that time, known as Mohammed XII, Abu Abdullah, known in the West as Boabdil, to secretly agree to hand over the city to the Christians. As he left the city, he paused to look back at Alhambra Palace and its splendid gardens, and he said, Allahu Akbar, he said, God is most great, and he burst into tears, only to be reminded by his mother Aisha, who stood beside him. You may well weep like a woman, she said, for what you could not defend like a man. The spot where Boabdil took his sad farewell, looked at his city from where he was banished forever, bears to this day the name that the last sigh of the Moor, il ultimato soprano di Moro.
Arif, any final words?
I think what I would say to our listeners is always go back and look at the history again. It's no big secret that when an opponent comes in, they try and write out the good points of the previous regime And there were so many good parts, so many good aspects of the Muslim rule that people tend to have forgotten them. I hope that we've covered a few of these in these programs, but I would ask, our listeners to go and look at it, because it's such a wealth of
Our
treasure.
history is such a rich subject, and we certainly hope that we've given people some enthusiasm and a flavor of history. Thank you both very much again, and until our next program, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.